Welcome back inside our TSN studios. Hockey Insiders Bob McKenzie, Pierre LeBrun, and Darren Dreger. Bob, the size of this number, especially since Austin Matthews was a restricted free agent, not an unrestricted free agent, does this indeed change the landscape of the Toronto Maple Leaf franchise and maybe the NHL as a whole moving forward?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Gino. There's no question in my mind that the landscape is changing for guys coming out of entry level, these superstar franchise players that seem to be populating the league all over the place, and lots of teams are going to be going through this. I think there's a number of points to make here. Number one, I think the Leafs signing John Tavares changed absolutely everything. So you've got a veteran guy that comes in the prime of his career, and he's making $11 million a year. He's an accelerant. He accelerated the Leafs. They became a much better team a lot quicker. And as a result of that, the Leafs are faced with this situation. Now, if John Tavares weren't here, there's no doubt in my mind the Leafs would have signed Austin Matthews to the 8-year contract and done the Connor McDavid route, except, and this is where you talk about the changing landscape, not just for the Leafs but around the league, is just because Connor McDavid signed an 8-year deal at $12.5 million doesn't mean that every player that perceives himself as a franchise number one center is going to sign the same sort of deal. And if Austin Matthews were going to sign an 8-year deal, it would have been much closer to $14 million a year. And both he and the Leafs recognized very quickly, you know what, that's not going to work for the Toronto Maple Leafs with Tavares at $11 million, with Mitch Marner coming, Nylander at $7 million, and on it goes. So now there's a lot of Leaf fans saying, okay, great, then we thought we were going to get him for $8 million, but we'll get him for $5 million, but then we're going to get a much lower number. And they look at that McDavid number at $12.5 million, and they're thinking we should get Matthews at $10 million or whatever. Well, keep in mind that he's looking at 8 years, close to $14 million if he were going to go that route. And so he is giving a discount, the $2 million plus to come down on a 5-year deal at 11.6 or thereabouts. And I just think overall, what we're seeing is NHL hockey players, the young guys, they're much more empowered. This is not a criticism at all. In fact, just an observation. But I get the feeling that they look at the NBA and the athletes in the NBA and they say, I like the cut of their jib. I like the way they're doing business. And they're not doing it exclusively like NBA players, but I think they're going to start doing it a lot more like that. In a salary cap world, that creates problems.
Well, there's a financial swagger that these players now have going into the second year of their NHL contracts. I mean, historically, you would look at a young player, regardless of how good he was, and they'd want the financial security that comes in term and the millions that are tacked onto that. That's not the case with these young guys anymore. You know, Austin Matthews is betting and banking on the fact that he is going to continue to excel and develop as an NHL superstar. So going into year 5 of the extension, then he's looking at another grand slam. But look, Kyle Dubas did a nice job of answering the questions there, but he is facing some enormous financial challenges in the not-too-distant future. And, we're pegging the end of the season when Darren Ferris, begins the negotiations on what that extension is going to look like. We'll take a look at Austin Matthews' deal at 5 years and $11.634. That's what Mitch Marner's contract looks like. And I don't think that it's going to be much softer than that, if at all.
So you're suggesting now that if they're looking at a 5-year term and you were comparing apples to apples, he's going to be looking for the same number. And if if he's looking for the same number, do the Leafs then have to say we can't afford that number and then start considering a bridge?
Probably. I mean, they've got to get off that 5 years so that you're not.
It makes
zero
sense for the Leafs to sign Mitch Marner to the same term as Austin Matthews for the very reason that they want to avoid duplicating this very scenario where there are two franchise players are up at the same time, number one.
But that's the deal he wants.
No, there's no question. But I'm saying I think the Leafs for sure will want to go shorter or longer than what they just did with Austin Matthews. The second thing I would say here is, is this going to set a new trend or is this actually a retro move by the Leafs and Austin Matthews? If you consider that, two teams that have won a bunch of championships in the last decade went 5 years out of entry level with their superstars. Pittsburgh went 5 years with Crosby and Malkin, and Chicago went 5 years with Kane and Taves before those star players had their third contracts. And so to me, as much as I totally agree with what Bob is saying about the young RFA and the kind of swagger and the wealth and all, I think that's all true. But I also think that the Leafs took a page out of the Chicago-Pittsburgh book and says, let's maximize our cap situation right now in the next 5 years and try and win.
You're right. The Toronto Maple Leafs aspired to be what the Chicago Blackhawks were, what the Pittsburgh Penguins have been, maybe continue to be, when you've got Malkin and Crosby and you've got Kane and Taves. What's difficult and different for the Leafs is that I mentioned Malkin and Crosby, and I mentioned Kane and Taves. Well, you've got Tavares and you've got Matthews. Well, wait a second. To your point, Darren.
Right.
In Mitch Marner's heart of hearts and in his mind, there is absolutely no question in his mind or his camp's mind that he's worth every bit as much as Austin Matthews and shouldn't have to take a dime less. And here's where the rubber hits the road. The Leafs are not going to see it that way. And, not for me to project negotiations that haven't even started yet, but I'm sure that they want to try to get him on a number that's like closer to $9 or $10 million a year as opposed to 11 plus. That's what they need to have, because I don't know if, I'm trying to think, Crosby and Malkin, Kane and Taves, is there another example of a championship team where they've got three forwards all making more than $11 million? And of course the answer is no, there isn't one.
Right.
So it's, can there be a new model that works that way? And so I think this is going to be a battle royale in terms of Mitch Marner looking for his deal. The Leafs will argue, oh, you know what? Matthews was a center. You heard Kyle Dubas. He's a premium position center. Premium elite goal scorer. You pay more for goal scoring. And they're going to try to Kucherov in 9-5 in Tampa as a comparable. And Marner's going to say, well, we don't care about Kucherov. He's in Florida. He doesn't pay state tax. And you know what? That's nice, but that's not the way we're doing things
and it
here.
all boils in, right? I mean, if you want to really crunch it, Mitch Marner had 13 points in 13 playoff games.
Absolutely.
Austin Matthews had 7 points in 13 playoff games. And, there are also others who will say that there are 20 teams around the National Hockey League who've got a star winger who's just as good as their top center or better.
Yeah, and you're going to see that more. Like this offseason, Panarin.
Sure.
What's Panarin going to look for in free agency? I'll bet you it starts with an 11.
It's not. I don't think anybody's saying that Marner's not worth the dollars or that Matthews is not worth the dollars.
Can
The
they all
question is, can you do it? Because half of the salary cap,
And
you bring it all together, there are over $40 million.
And the Marner camp has done. The Marner camp's done the right thing by waiting for Matthews to sign first. Let's be clear, because that was really the only leverage point they could ever get out of all this, is to know where the magnet was and to get as close to the magnet as possible, like Draisaitl did with McDavid. The other thing, to the last comment Kyle Dubas made today, I thought was very telling. Sometimes the more a GM talks in a media scrum, the more the truth seems to seep out. And then right at the end, he said about Marner that Marner, regardless of how it would work out, would be a Leaf for a long time, one way or another. You know what that was about. That was a little threat to all the other teams in the league. As Darren reported last week, who are having their little meetings talking about an offer sheet. The Leafs are saying, bring it on. I mean, bring it on. It's going to destroy their cap situation if there is an offer sheet. But I think clearly they would match any offer sheet, even if it gets there. To me, there's going to be a power play from the Leafs front office by the June draft to end that whole thing.